So yeah, would love to first of all welcome Helen. Helen is a mum of 2 young children, as well as being the head of individual giving at Crisis, and she leads a team of 25 to raise 60% of the organisation's income each year. She spent over 14 years working in the fundraising sector, charity sector, and that's built on her love for people, different cultures and travel. And I think that love for people is definitely a big part of the success that you had in this project. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how Helen took a host approach to leadership, and we'll talk a bit more about what that means, and essentially kind of focusing in on specific needs and how to meet them, tailoring the agile principles to the work that you need to do, and also creating a consensus around what priorities are shared by simplifying them and bringing people together. And so, Helen, can you start by just telling us a little bit about what the situation was that you were given?
Yeah. Hello everyone. Thank you for giving up your lunchtime to listen to this. I hope it really is useful. I think my challenge today is I'm talking about something that was a marketing issue, but try to not make this a marketing conversation. So I'm going to try really, really hard not to do that and to keep it at like principles level. So please do let me know if I drift into marketing acronyms and too much marketing detail, which nobody wants at lunchtime. Stop. Susan's saying she's having problems with sound, but just checking that's not everybody. No, good. Okay, so the main challenge that I started working with Tilt on was something that we'd said to the trustees that was a really important piece of work. So it was something that we really, really wanted to focus on. And that was to get mass awareness for our Christmas campaign at Crisis. So probably a lot of you know about our Christmas campaign. It's annual. It's a really big thing that Crisis does at Christmas, and my team leads on that. But the mass awareness was to make that campaign speak louder with one voice. And the challenge is that lots of different departments and lots of different teams can create mass awareness. And my remit, my official remit, is in one of those teams, not all of those teams. So the challenge really was that work had been done on it, but in pockets and in different departments and around the organisation. So really it was trying to align that work and that sort of momentum to make the biggest impact for our Christmas campaign and work towards a goal that really felt shared. And I think that was the main sort of crux of it.
Brilliant. And how did you go about starting to address that?
Well, do you know what? Being completely honest, I did not think of agile straight away. It didn't sort of come into my mind. I mean, I was familiar with agile, and I'd had a training course that Crisis had provided, which was more along the tech side of things. So the Crisis people here will remember that. That was sort of January 2020, just before the world changed slightly. And then I had been the product owner of an agile pilot for an emergency appeal in 2020. And again, it was quite tech focused. It was really interesting because it helped me sort of put the core principles and roles into use. Okay. But what we didn't do is we didn't get to a stage where it felt like it was saving any time or sort of changing the way we were working. And I think that's because we hadn't really changed any sort of the supporting structures around it. So I didn't think, oh, definitely I'll use agile, but actually because it was a sort of a time-bound and discrete project, B, who is on the call at the moment, and Kira, who I'm not sure is, they are the agile champions at Crisis, and they suggested, why don't you work with Tilt, so Eleanor and Julia, because actually this might be quite a good time-bound specific project to get agile support on. And obviously the focus of Till and Julia's support specifically wasn't on what tech to use, but to support me to understand how best to achieve those core objectives that I had and the core needs of the mass awareness activity, and then sort of use tailored ways of working to meet them. Yeah, so I think that's really how it all came about.
I think also I would just add that it was kind of an organisation-wide project, and you're working towards something that's really important to the organisation, which is Christmas. So yeah, I think that was another big part of why you got support from us.
Yeah, and actually also it then that your support then widened out, because actually then what happened is it broadened into me trying to align our mass media strategy and approach for the whole organization. So it got bigger than a project, but I applied the same principles with your support.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's really interesting. You sort of rolled it out even further than the original intention. And obviously you had been looking into, you know, a similar role, similar questions the previous year. So what did you take from that year, and how did you change the way that you handled it for this year?
Yeah, well, it was really interesting because, yeah, I had been trying to achieve this in the previous year, and it just hadn't worked. And actually what Tilt supported me to do was hold a retrospective. So definitely an agile principle there, to hold a retrospective on the previous year, and then together we sort of reviewed the feedback from key stakeholders and really just took the time to reflect on why it hadn't worked. Because I think my approach probably when I first spoke to Julia was, I've tried it, I've worked really hard and it hasn't happened, and I don't know why. And we reflected and we sort of used the feedback to identify the key reasons it hadn't and respond to those challenges. And that was really, really enlightening in terms of how we adapted moving forward. So I think the key reasons that came out were that even though other teams were delivering mass awareness, they couldn't really see the value for them and their objectives, their personal teamed objectives of supporting this specific activity. And they hadn't factored it into their resource plans the previous year. So what we did then was we really sort of listened to that and we said, right, well, how can we address those points moving forward? And I think that's where the sort of host leadership element came in as well, because host leadership is basically a way to take a leading position, but in a way that draws others in quite a natural way. And that builds engagement, and that then hopefully follows on to sort of performance and results. And I think that it was really clear then that that's what was needed, because we know there's value in doing it, but actually if others don't see value in doing it, then there is no point me standing here and saying that is important. I need to bring those people in and create that engagement. So although that might not feel like it's anything to do with agile, it really was the bedrock of everything that we did that was agile. So I think what we did then, once we'd agreed that, is formed a core group of people who each owned an area of mass awareness across the organisation, and we formed that 2022 project team. And we then collectively agreed to better identify the user needs within a new plan. So we co-created objectives, and they felt co-owned by everybody in there. Everybody sort of saw value as, I know why I'm in this project team, I know the value I can add, and I know why it's good for my team as well as the collective. So we co-created those objectives and the measures of success, and then we got a clear KPIs and objectives to show the benefit to all parties, and a clear agreement sort of pre-business planning, so before it got into the pipeline, that support would be required for this to address the capacity issue early on.
I just want to reflect on that as well. I think a big part of what worked really well was that you did show people the value to them, but then you also kind of made sure they were sharing that responsibility. They weren't doing it for you, they were doing it because they saw the value, and you were really clear from up front they were just as involved in delivering that as you. So things like you had people involved in kind of managing the work, monitoring the work, keeping things up to date. They weren't just updating you. And yeah, I think that was all a big part of it as well.
Yeah, I agree. Putting in sort of regular time to like discuss, collaborate, make decisions, and that all helped to increase responsibility, but also keep the momentum going and connection. So we really went into quite a lot of detail with it in an agile way. So we'd say, right, this is the KPI, but who is measuring that, how, when, and whether that might be external agencies that were needed. We brought external agencies in as well. But I think the key part of it as well is that it really is that host leadership, in that each representative has their own area of expertise to develop a plan. So one person is never going to develop the best plan because they don't have all those elements. So part of mass awareness is media, so you need a media expert. Part of mass awareness is it's shared media, so you need someone from the corporate team who's an expert on that. And actually, you know, the marketing team are a key part of that, and they wrote their own brief to ask an agency for mass awareness that wasn't written by me or my team, but would really benefit me and my team, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
The corporate team put together a sponsorship pack to attract corporate partners. That wasn't a central role, that was needed to be done by the expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just host leadership is kind of in contrast to like hero leadership is what I've read. So hero leadership would be kind of leading from the front, having all the answers, kind of being the go-to person. And obviously that works in certain scenarios, but what you're talking about is kind of where nobody really had the definitive answer, finding a way to bring people together. And I really like the analogy of like being a host at a party, just kind of making sure everyone has what they need, but the party is still a collective experience. So I think that's a really nice way of putting it. And I think you did that really, really well.
Yeah.
Were there any other principles or approaches that you found really useful?
I think definitely that everyone sees value in being part of it, which I know we've touched on. And then that co-creation and consensus around what we're actually trying to achieve is really important. And again, ownership taken by the right people with the right skills, which is what we've said. I think just meeting regularly and unblocking challenges as you go, which is, I guess, an agile principle to keep the momentum going. But then a really big one, I think, for this was adapting and flexing as we go and building it as we go. So it's what we always talk about, Julia. We didn't say at the start, right, this is the outcome and this is the strategy we're going to use to get there. We just started, what is the objective we want to achieve, how best to achieve that, and then we just move that along as we go.
Yeah, and I think that and the kind of host style of leadership is a really good example of the agile principle of like people over processes. So really being led by what was needed and not by trying to define a step-by-step plan from the beginning. And like you said, you were able then to develop the approach as you went to be really, really effective.
Yeah, and I think that for the wider piece as well, that was really effective in that, because we did sort of use our existing business planning structure, but it was more about going where the energy was to align our paid mass media as an organization as a whole. So we had a new media partner, so that was it, that was the energy. So we were like, right, okay, we can simplify this and we can align it using them, because we're all feeding into this one place anyway.
Yeah.
So instead of each team sort of briefing an agency separately, we took a holistic approach and did it all as one. So I think it was a good example of flexing there and going and using an opportunity that comes up.
Yeah, absolutely. And what were you measuring the success of this work on, and have you got any results on any of that so far?
Yeah, the main goal that we agreed, which is to get mass awareness, and we've got some metrics that sit underneath that in terms of what exactly that means in like a 1% uplift of, but I won't go into that because that's getting too much into marketing detail. But the main goal will be assessed after the campaign has run. So it runs until the end of December. So we'll assess it then. But what we think we needed to achieve that goal, we have put in place. So what we wanted was a corporate partner that the specific audience segment that we're aiming for cares about. And we got our corporate team have got Specsavers on board this year, which is the first time we've sort of got a mass awareness sponsor deliberately for Christmas. That's fantastic, and we hope to build on that in the future years as well. We wanted an earned and owned media strategy that focused on that audience segment in October, November and December, and we've got that in place. And we wanted we always do some organizational research in sort of October, November, and it's usually just not linked to the campaign. So we wanted to say, well, actually, when we release that research, it goes out into the wider world and it gets us mass awareness. So if we link it to what the campaign is, so we've agreed that that's going to be linked to cost of living now, and we've factored that into our media for the campaign. So there's 3 separate elements there that we can take and say we have got that. We've never done it before, so we don't know exactly what the impact will be, and we're going to have to measure that. And we've got lots of tracking things in place to measure, you know, that's sort of too much marketing speak, but top of the funnel, high level awareness, and we're going to track that down and see what impact it has. And then I guess for the wider sort of piece, we sort of successfully expanded this sort of Christmas mass awareness work into mass awareness as a whole by building on this little microcosm that we're working on, and helping it respond to a bigger, broader challenge, which is just mass awareness, how we do mass awareness as an organization as a whole. And we're now going to embed this into organizational process, which is really exciting, with quarterly strategic mass reviews that we can learn from and adapt. And I think each user in the wider work now has a clearer idea of how their piece of mass fits into the bigger puzzle of mass, and we're sort of communicating more as a whole. So I'm really, really excited about that as well.
Brilliant. And what would you say are kind of the key things that you've learned or taken away?
I think I don't know, this might sound a little bit bad, but I think one of the biggest learnings is, when I used to think of agile, I used to think of tech, but that you don't actually need tech to be agile. With this, it was about hearts and minds, and why it's about the sort of host leadership. I mean, tech is useful. I'm not going to lie, we did use a Trello board, but that's pretty much the only tech that we used. And we could have just met without that. It was very useful. I would advocate it, but yeah, you definitely don't need it. And I think actually building responsibility, accountability, momentum from the beginning is really important, but you don't need an existing process, or you don't need to agree on a process up front. You can sort of get started and then build that as you go. And I think that you tweak it based on what you learn. I think that's really important. And that's what we're going to keep doing. So what I've just said here is this Christmas, but there will be a next Christmas and a Christmas after, and there'll be every quarter that we review mass, and we're just going to keep learning, keep improving and building on it. And then I think the final point is that if you want to build responsibility, accountability, momentum, you do need true co-collaboration. You can't just say it. So it's not just lip service. You need to really understand what value other users could get from it and ensure it meets that value, because otherwise there's no incentive there to put effort into it. But that does require having really honest conversations, and we had some honest conversations, I will tell you, at the start of this in the retrospective, and we did have to really listen to them, and we did have to really adapt based on them. So I do think that host leadership piece is key there.
I would just kind of elaborate on that as well, that I think you had a really good understanding of your users at different levels. So obviously people often think of users as, people who might support the charity, kind of the general public, but you also really recognize your internal audiences and who the people were that you needed to bring along those hearts and minds. Who are they and what do they need? And I think that really helped. I remember you saying something really interesting as well at one point about how it didn't feel like at the time, or even looking back, it didn't feel like you were being strategic, or that you kind of had a strategic plan or had kind of done it well, because it was kind of, it all just developed as you went.
Yeah.
Would you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I do think it was quite like a discomfort at the start. And I do think that is something that's probably one to think about with Agile and to get over, because we imagine strategy to be like, okay, at the start of the year, from the top with a plan, we're all signing up to this plan, and it just was none of that. It was the opposite of that. So I didn't always feel like I was being strategic, because I didn't know in a year what it would look like, or have that sort of long term, it's going to look like this. I had an outcome in mind, but I didn't know how I was going to get there. So it's sort of, in a way, felt like because you're adapting each meeting, you're sort of winging it almost, in a way, it feels like, even though it isn't, because as long as you focus on that outcome, that is strategic. So this is the outcome that we require. What is the best way to get to that? And if that needs to change, then that needs to change. That is the strategy. But in my mind, it's quite different to what traditionally you might think of as a strategy. And yeah, I think that was definitely a big learning for me. And that's one thing that I think I'll take forward into another piece of work that I do as well.
Yeah. I think just to kind of finish off, if there was one piece of advice you would go back in time and give yourself if you were going to do this all again, what would you tell that person?
Just, well, not from this year, but I think from the year before, just really listen. because I think there was a lot of things being said that came out in the retrospective that could have been listened to and built in earlier. And it might not always be what you want to hear, and that's fine, because there's always a way, if you've got a shared goal, to find a way around that. Even if it seems like a blocker, it's not a blocker, it's just a piece of information that you need to work around.
I think that's great. I'd just add to that as well. I think it's something that, you know, often is quite difficult to do, because you almost feel like you're all pulling in different directions because you need different things, but actually you did a fantastic job of taking all those different needs and aligning them around a shared goal. So you're not fighting against that, you're accepting that and using that to inform what you do next. I think that's all of my questions, and thank you so much, Helen. I think that was brilliant.